Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining today's Best Practice webinar. My name is Ghislaine. I will go into full introductions in just a minute here, but I do want to set the tone for today's webinar. We'll be focused on data-driven call coaching, and the primary way we're going to get there is through scorecards. So you all should be fairly familiar with that feature, given that you are an ExecVision customer. And we're always happy to support the build out for your internal instance. I am not here alone today. I do have Chris on the line, who is actually an active ExecVision user and will be introducing himself in just a minute here. But for those of you that have already joined us, you probably recognize my voice, but I am the Director of Customer Success over at ExecVision and have probably worked with most of you in terms of getting your instance live, fully implemented, and getting you some value on the platform. Now, Chris, can you hear me?
Yep, I hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself to the masses?
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Chris Bryson. I head up sales development at SmartRecruiters, and we love ExecVision. We use it for so much of our coaching, and I'm really excited to talk about our scorecard process today.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Chris. And if anyone on the line is on Twitter, please get social with us. I do have the ExecVision handle up on the screen, as well as Chris's personal Twitter handle, as well as the SmartRecruiters handle. Tweet us questions, thoughts, feedback, anything at all. We will be monitoring Twitter, and we should get back to you by the end of today. All right. So in terms of today's focus, this is going to be all about using data to drive coaching activity. And the primary way we're going to do this in ExecVision is actually through scorecards. So that said, we'll be focusing on what a scorecard is. We'll talk through how you're able to create scorecards. Once they're created, how can you best make use of them? After that, we're going to dive right into SmartRecruiter's story around how they developed scorecards from start to finish and how they're actively using it today. At the very end of today's session, we will spend a couple of minutes on Q&A, so please make sure you're jotting down your questions. You are encouraged to send the questions throughout the session using your GoToMeeting, or excuse me, GoToWebinar panel on the side here. But aside from that, we're going to keep this pretty punchy. We're going to move through the slides as fast as possible. We have you for 30 minutes, so we want to deliver as much value, as much information in a short amount of time as possible, all right? So that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. I do want to mention, actually, before I talk through what a scorecard is, that this session is currently being recorded, and we will be sharing it out to all the registrants by the end of today. All right, so what is a scorecard? A scorecard is really a method for you to grade the overall performance of any call. The scorecard itself is actually made up of key elements, key aspects to how an ideal call should flow. And one of the primary benefits of it is that it generates a score, a numerical quantitative score to the rep's performance on a specific call. Now, the reason why these scores are super helpful is because you can begin to track a rep's progression over a period of time. So are my reps getting better given the coaching activity that we're putting into them? Or are they getting worse? And if that's the case, maybe the coaching just isn't as effective as we thought. That said, the scorecards do really help to expose where there might be potential gaps in skill performance, meaning the rep might think that they're an all-star, a 5 out of 5 across the board, but reality is far from it, and they're actually closer to a 1 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5 when it comes to these key elements. And last but not least, another amazing benefit of scorecards is that it forces alignment on what a good call sounds like. So if there's any question around, is the management team aligned on these important key elements, the exercise of developing a scorecard will really expose any discrepancies that may exist on your management team and will help get everyone aligned on that goal. what an ideal call sounds like. Up on the screen, I am showing you our internal sales scorecard. This one is fairly generic and typically fits for most sales conversations, but we found that these questions work really, really well for a sales development team. So just running through this, what you're seeing here are 7 questions that speak to how well the rep did in the call's introduction, how effective they were in overcoming objections and engaging the buyer, how effective they were in identifying all the key stakeholders in the decision-making process, how effective the rep was in asking probing questions to really uncover challenges and do their due diligence and discovery. Next up, we want to make sure the rep's delivering a relevant value prop after they've done their digging and they've uncovered pain points. We want to make sure that the value prop is aligned to those pain points. Of course, we want to make sure that our reps are presenting and recommending the best solution to the buyer. And of course, what's the call without next steps? You want to make sure that the next steps are clear, action items are defined, and both parties leave that conversation knowing what to expect. On the right-hand side of the questions is a 5-point scale. So this is what I was referring to earlier when I was saying, you know, maybe a rep thinks they're a 5 out of 5, when in reality, they would be on the other end of the spectrum. So this 5-point scale is really helpful in terms of identifying where those gaps in skill perception do exist. Next up, obviously we want to know how to create a scorecard. Now I'm going to lean on Chris in just a minute here, but one of the things I want to call out is that this is really a great way for you to sit down with your management team and identify what the easiest behavior changes are that have the greatest impact on your revenue. And then following that, what is the team currently good at? And where are they struggling? So those behavioral changes, those easy wins, if you will, that would have a great impact on your bottom line should be what really formulates the backbone of your scorecard, especially the elements that your team currently struggles with. Because that's where, you know, we've really got to beef up our skill set and get better, so that way we can increase our bottom line, get more revenue. In terms of a best practice, I do recommend that you have anywhere between 5 to 10 questions per scorecard. And these questions should be drafted in a very easy to understand manner. That way there aren't any questions around what that element really speaks to. And a good way to just think of that is to keep it simple, stupid. And I have an amazing quote on the next slide, but before I move into it, Chris, do you have any thoughts on how SmartRecruiters is able to create your scorecard?
Yeah, so it all starts with the thought that you can't manage what you can't measure. And when you're managing a sales development team, it's all about the content of their calls, right? And how they're actually conducting each piece. So for us, we already knew exactly what has to happen on each call. There has to be an opener, there has to be qualification, some pain building, and next steps, which we saw on the previous slide. So for us, we already knew it, but what we were able to do was create a training framework around that and then align it to our scorecard. So in addition to having the scorecard, it's really important that you certify people on it and have a framework for receiving the training that's going to align to your scorecard.
Oh yeah, that framework is key. I mean, without a consistent framework for the reps to follow after the scorecard is developed, I mean, how do you ensure that people are using it? How do you ensure that people are consistently getting better using those key questions within your grader? I love that. I'm excited to hear more about that framework later on. So this is a quote I always lean on. I love it. Most of you on the line probably know who Steve Richard is. He's our Chief Revenue Officer. And outside of that, he's a bit of a sales coaching celebrity, if you will. But one of his biggest recommendations is always around keeping your scorecard questions incredibly simple. So this quote speaks to that. He's essentially saying that anyone in the world who knows nothing about your business, about what you sell, your products, your offerings, they should be able to listen to one of your reps' calls and answer the questions on the scorecard just like you would. And that really speaks to keeping those questions incredibly simple, concise, and clear. So once your scorecard is developed, what do we do? There are 4 use cases that we're going to run through today. This by no means is the only way you can use scorecards, but given that we only have a 30-minute slot, we're going to cover 4 use cases. Those include how to leverage scorecards for peer-to-peer coaching, how to use the scorecards during a one-on-one between a manager and a rep. We're going to cover how you can best use scorecards for new hire onboarding, as well as how to use scorecards consistently to ensure that the management team is calibrated on what good sounds like. So when it comes to peer-to-peer coaching, Chris, how has SmartRecruiters really adopted this internally?
Yeah, so this is a use case that's really near and dear to my heart. Peer-to-peer coaching is probably the most important thing that we do. So we've adopted it because we have a coaching culture. So even before we started using ExecVision, everybody that we have on our team has been hired because they're receptive to feedback and coachable. But really, what we found that we can get a lot more out of it if it's not just a manager giving feedback. In fact, what our top rep is is actually the one that people look to, right? They're in the trenches every day. They're working really hard, and when they give somebody feedback, it means a lot because although you want your SDR manager getting into calls and still engaging with prospects, they're not doing it as much as maybe your top SDR. So if you have that coaching culture, it's a great way to spread the love a little bit, right? And it's a great way to empower somebody on your team as a mentor and put them on a management track if that's something that they're looking into. Again, I would caution that if you're going to do peer-to-peer coaching, that you don't make it a free for all, or else you might get some unexpected results. But we'll get into that a little bit later with the training framework and how to certify people and make sure that they actually know how to provide coaching and that they're giving feedback on the things that actually matter in an objective way. But it's really key, and it's something that we do here at SmartRecruiters every day.
Yeah, I love it. And I mean, what you said there, Chris, is huge. The fact that a peer who's in the trenches, who's smiling and dialing, they live and die by the phone with the team, the fact that someone in that role is then coaching their peers speaks volumes. And the peer is going to be more receptive to internalizing that feedback because it's coming from someone who gets it, right? Someone who's on the phone with them, who hears the objections, who's living the same type of conversations day in and day out. And that is one thing, if you're going to walk away with anything from this webinar, when it comes to peer-to-peer coaching, just make sure that it's a top performer on the team who it has the bandwidth, who is willing to help the other members of the team get better. Because of course, I mean, we're all about coaching here. I know that you can appreciate that, Chris. So when it comes to coaching, we want to make sure that people are committed to helping one another.
Yeah, it's a great way to get a force multiplier for your coaching, because if you put in the work building a great scorecard and then doing the actual legwork of certifying people and having them go through a framework, it's easy to have it go and do a lot of extra work for you.
Totally. And that said, I mean, that also frees up management time too, if you have peer coaches helping out. One of the key things here that I know, Chris, you and I have talked about fairly often in the past is all about making sure that your management team is spot checking anything a mentor coaches. That way you can ensure that alignment is maintained moving forward. Are you guys doing any of that at SmartRecruiters?
Absolutely, and that's really important because we discussed how great it can be to get mentor feedback from somebody that's a day-to-day practitioner, but again, like, you still need to do your job as a manager. You got to get in there. You have to manage the process, make sure that people are following the scorecard that you created, that they're giving feedback in a productive way. One thing that, we've had to correct for from time to time is that, a rep gives a little bit too much feedback on a variety of different topics. And that's really overwhelming if you're receiving the feedback, and it makes it hard to focus. So that's something that we look for when we review peer feedback, is making sure that the mentor is just picking one skill to focus on and not tearing somebody down, even though they're trying to be helpful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge best practice, and I know we're going to get to that in the next few slides here. All right, scorecards and one-on-ones. So I'm going to run through some best practices that we've seen work time and time again. They're tried and true. Then I'm going to flip things over to Chris to share how SmartRecruiters is using the scorecard function in one-on-ones. But essentially the workflow speaks to having your reps pre-select a call, or maybe it's multiple calls, before their one-on-one. The expectation is that the rep is listening to themselves, they're self-reviewing, and they're scoring themselves before they come to the one-on-one with you. Now, during the one-on-one, the manager should actually be playing the call out loud while they're sitting down with the rep. So that way, both parties are listening to what's being covered. Everyone is hearing the same thing. We're 100% aligned. Now, while the call is playing, the manager can score the conversation. So you can actually have the recording play while you're going through those scorecard questions within ExecVision, which is a bit of a little pro tip there. Another tip I would have, if you're going to play the call out loud while your rep is sitting with you, is to ensure that you're actually playing it at an advanced speed back. So I would actually bump it up to 1.5 times the speed versus playing it at 1 times the speed, which is essentially just real time. So after the manager has filled out the scorecard, you can then see how both parties graded the same conversation. So this is where it gets fun. You can really begin to see, where those gaps exist between how the rep graded themselves versus how the manager graded themselves. And one beautiful workflow that I always like to reference when I meet with my customers actually pulls on a learning that we got from Jim Keenan from a sales guy. So he has a 3-point system where first you want to observe what was said on the call. Simply describe what you heard and go through each of the questions on your scorecard and describe how the rep actually performed, right? We're just observing at this point. The next step is to have the rep themselves describe what the ideal behavior should have been for each of those elements. And third, we develop a game plan to close the gaps that we've identified in point 2. But we really want to hyper-focus on one skill at a time. Now, I know that this is something that Chris mentioned earlier, but Chris, do you have any thoughts that you can share with us when it comes to focusing on one skill at a time when you're coaching through scorecards?
Yeah, it's so important to do that because you have to remember that everybody's got plenty to work on. And if you're going after every little piece at once, it's going to be really overwhelming for your rep. Even though it's not intentional, and you might even say, hey, we're not trying to tear you down here. It's going to come off that way, and it's not going to be an effective use of your time. There's a lot of gains that can be had from focusing on the one skill that needs the most improvement. Just think about if you have a rep that can't close a call, right? That can't schedule a meeting. If you just focus on working on that, that's going to have a lift for them immediately, right? So when we do our one-on-ones, that's exactly what we do. So everybody knows what they need to be working on from previous coaching. And again, I'll clarify that when we do our one-on-ones, we don't always do call recordings, so it's not every single week. But we do follow this format where we coach through the scorecard. So for us, that might look like a brief discussion before the call where the rep's like, yeah, I know I need to work on closing the call. I think that this call I did a good job or bad job. So they'll bring, a good or a bad call to be reviewed. They'll listen to it. They'll go through the entire scorecard process and then be able to see if they're aligned on it. So if the manager's score is very different from the rep score, that means, hey, actually there's still some work that needs to be done here. Here's the steps that we're going to take to improve. So the scorecard's really great for helping call out any issues that are happening with your call.
And I think this screenshot here on the next slide really helps to illustrate that point, Chris. So right here, just to let the masses know what we're looking at, the first column is actually the score that the rep's manager left for him. And we actually had a number of different people weigh in on this call. It's a mix of peers, it's a mix of our sales trainer, as well as the rep's manager and the rep themselves. So the manager is that first column, Rachel. She scored Alex at a 72%. One thing I do want to call out here is question 1. So Rachel said that Alex was a 3 out of 5, which in our world says, maybe, right? You may have had an effective introduction, but we should probably talk about it. It looks like his peer in the next column over is aligned with that same exact response, and so is the person in the column over as well. So we're seeing 3s and 4s. Now, when we get to the last column, that's actually the rep's grade. For some reason, it looks like here that Alex gave himself a 5 out of 5, whereas his own manager said he was more of a 3 out of 5. So what I would imagine is happening here is that the manager, Rachel, is working closely with Alex to identify why there's a gap there in the first place. Let's talk about your introduction. Why do you think you did an effective job? And then let's work towards closing that gap to make sure that we're aligned. So that way, moving forward, when Alex selects a 5, so does his manager. They both are on the complete same page. They both know that that area of the call was executed in the way that they graded it. So, Chris, any thoughts on this? I know you chuckled when I first flipped into this slide.
Yeah, it's just the first time that you actually do this exercise, it can be really eye-opening, and you either have reps that are too hard on themselves or think that they're perfect on a skill where they're really missing the boat. So, this just perfectly demonstrates that, a 5 out of 5 means that you nailed it. And if your manager, has you at a maybe a 3, there's clearly like there's some work that needs to be done here. So this makes it really easy to call out those situations and address them.
Absolutely. All right, so scorecards and new hires. I'm going to run through this one fairly quickly. I know that we are approaching the end of our scheduled time here, so I want to be cognizant of everyone's schedules today. So when it comes to onboarding new hires, one best practice that we certainly do recommend is having the reps record any mock calls or role plays that they're doing during that onboarding process. Now, after the call has been recorded, we strongly recommend you get that loaded into ExecVision if you are an existing customer. And then the manager or the trainer can actually sit down and score these role plays in a group setting with all of the other new hires. Now, what this really helps to do is instill the fact that coaching is a priority to your organization and make it a very transparent activity. People are going to naturally shy away from having their recordings played out loud in a group setting. But at the end of the day, if everyone's on the same page of what good sounds like, and if you could learn something from hearing a peer, you can pick up some secret sauce that they have in their calls just by listening to their conversations in a group setting. I mean, that goes a long way later on, and it really helps managers in terms of repurposing lessons. Now, for new hires specifically, we want to make sure that we're grading them, because you could even tie this into some sort of certification. So all of your new folks that have a high score could essentially become certified, and I'm doing that with bunny quote, air quotes here. They'll be certified to sell on the team, but you can also offer up some sort of incentive, a gift card, or maybe even a half day of PTO right out the gate when they first start to really reward the good behavior that they're exhibiting on the phone. Next up, I do want to spend some time on how you can use scorecards when it comes to management calibrating on what good sounds like. And I know that this is something that Chris's team adopted very early on in their relationship with ExecVision. But I'll just run through what this workflow is at a fairly high level before I have Chris speak to it. So the concept here is really that all of your team leads come to a management meeting with one call per team already identified. Now, the game plan at that point is to actually play the calls out loud as each manager scores the conversations on their own. So each manager has their own laptop in front of them. They have the scorecard up. The recording is being played out loud, and they're running through and grading the same call. Now, once all the managers have submitted their scores, you can then compare everyone's scores across the board and discuss where gaps may exist within your management team. Now, this is so incredibly important because you want to make sure that the management team is aligned on what each rep is being coached towards. Because if the management team isn't aligned, then you're going to see all sorts of discrepancies in terms of team performance, depending on who the manager is. Now, Chris, I know you guys spent some time on this as well. What are some feedback, some thoughts that you can leave our attendees with today?
Yeah, don't skip this step. That's my first one. Is when you're rolling this out after you've built your scorecard and introduced it to the team, as you have calls coming in, get together, take the time to actually do this. So what we found is that there were parts of the call that we weren't on the same page about. There wasn't something drastically wrong, but we wanted to certify ourselves essentially and get on the same page with how we want to coach in order to make it consistent. And if you skip this, you're not going to be able to do it. So, we took a similar steps to what Ghislaine described with actually getting in a room, listening to the calls, scoring them, and just seeing if there were discrepancies. And it really helped us a lot. So I suggest that before you make a big commitment to rolling out a scorecard to your entire team, that you actually do this and that you review it on a consistent basis. Get your frontline managers doing this and have them know, what the expectation is from you on how the ideal call should sound, or else, you're just going to amplify bad behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Amplify bad behavior. That's a really good way to put it. So that said, Chris, I'm going to flip things over to you to walk us through how SmartRecruiters went through the process of developing scorecards and rolling them out.
Yeah, so it was really important to us to create a coaching culture. So we were able to take a couple steps to do this using data, right, and doing this in a way that's scalable and makes sense to to our senior leadership. So the first part was actually setting up robust call reporting. So this means just figuring out your different types of call outcomes, right? So a call that's attempted, a call connect, a conversation, and what success looks like. And if you've got a sales engagement tool, you should be having this data flow into your CRM. And if you're a sales ops guy or you have a Salesforce admin that's got basic skills, they should be able to help you report on that. The next step is diagnosing problems. So looking at that data and figuring out what's going on. So an example of this for us was that we had some people that had low success rates, but they were having really long call durations, right? So what was going on with that? When you listen to them, we figured out they don't know how to close a call. They can talk to somebody for a long time, but not actually close a call. And there were a few other examples similar to that led us down this line of creating a framework for training our reps and aligning them to a scorecard. So we can go through that now and talk about the steps that it takes to actually roll it out. So the first one is to talk to your team. So don't surprise them. Schedule a meeting, tell them that we're going to be doing this. Show the data that you've looked at to the team and say, hey, we've got a problem here with booking meetings because a lot of people are struggling with closing a call, or we have a lot of call connects, which means we've got good data and we're making we're doing activity, but maybe people aren't getting through the first initial hurdle that comes up in the call. And the reason why this is happening is because we need to take some corrective action and do coaching. So we're going to create a scorecard for that, and we're going to certify on each part of that scorecard with a training framework. So go ahead and host a presentation, and this might seem obvious, but I think it's really important to talk about how this should actually flow. So for us, it's to provide concrete steps on the skill that you're going to be talking about. So for us, that might be opening a call. So a manager will discuss exactly what that looks like, what it sounds like, provide examples for it, hold questions until the end, because you don't want this to become a free-for-all. So review that meeting format before you train with the team, so that they know that their questions will be answered, but they need to hold them till the end. Get to them, and then schedule next steps, which we'll get into in a minute here. But make sure that you actually have a format for this. So when you do Q&A, make sure that you start by having a high-level discussion of the content with the team. It's okay for people to provide feedback, but you want to make sure that it stays on track, and that every question that's asked is relevant to the skill that you're addressing. And it's it is an opportunity for people to suggest tactical changes. You'll often have really high performers that are able to provide a lot of really good feedback on how they think that the scorecard should work, which is helpful when you're first starting to roll this out.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I love about this framework, Chris, is the fact that at every step of the way, you're cognizant of the reps' buy-in. So making sure that they're involved from step one all the way through is, I'm sure, key. I mean, huge for your morale, because then they feel like they had a stake in developing this framework, and they're more likely to follow it through.
Yeah, if people haven't had input into this process, they're not going to adopt it. They're not going to have buy-in. So you have to do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And the last part is always assign homework. So this is a great way to have people go and start using ExecVision, start completing their scorecards and getting involved in peer coaching. Because what we'll do is a follow-up session where we actually review the homework. We have people listen to the calls, review the scorecards, and focus in on the particular piece that we've been training. And once you start getting through this flow and running through this training framework on a quarterly or basis or so, you really start to get people certified and aligned with what you're doing, and everybody understands each question that's on your scorecard very deeply. Did they have an effective opener? Well, we did a whole session on it where we talked about everything that has to do with opening a call. We did peer feedback on it. We listened to the call together, and everybody was certified at the end of it to know what a perfect call opener sounds like. And then you're really, starting to cook with gas, right? And the way that you do that is to assign the homework, right? You have to have people go through this transformative process, and you'll find that after people have done it a few times, they just start doing it on their own, right? And ExecVision, fortunately, makes it really easy to do this. So you could do it without it, but I don't think it would be too pretty.
Yep, agreed. I mean, there's so many hurdles in doing it without a tool like ExecVision. Like, first things first, finding the calls, right? And then from there, where do you store all the scores, all the notes from these coaching sessions? But I really love this framework. This is so concise. And by the way, for everyone on the line, we will be sending this recording out. Once again, for any latecomers, we will be sending this recording out following today's session. So you'll have all of this amazing information on demand later today.
Yeah, and then the last part is to do your manager review in one-on-one. So continue to iterate on this, go over the points that you discussed, listen to the same call, and provide feedback. And we talked about this, but it's important enough to bring it up again. The one-on-ones should have an agenda to them, and part of that has to be call coaching, right? So if you're not doing this, it doesn't have to be in every one-on-one, but if you're not doing this, you're really missing out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Amazing. So, Chris, Can I have you for a couple more minutes here? We do have a few questions that came through that I want to make sure we can address.
Sure.
All right, amazing. So the first question I've got speaks to what an organization should do if the management team is not aligned on those key elements to include in the scorecard.
Yeah, you have to get in a room and hash this out. Unfortunately, if you use ExecVision, it's easier to do than just have a high-level discussion. You can listen to the calls and complete the scorecard, right? And if you find that you're not aligned, you have to discuss that. And if you've got data points, that it's a lot easier to have a management discussion, right? Than just say, hey, I think that we should do this part of the call this way. You can actually see what's working and tie that back to the data that you have in your CRM, and look at, how is this affecting calls, and are the calls that are doing it in this particular way leading to successes?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I love that, just listening to real calls to help guide that calibration. Because without having insight into what's really happening on the front line, you just end up guessing. You don't really know what's going on. So when it comes to the rep portion of scorecards, how often do you have your reps fill out scorecards?
Yeah, so at a minimum, we have them do one good call and one bad call a week. And this doesn't mean that's the only calls that they're listening to. They request feedback on a lot of calls, or they might leave comments, but filling out the full scorecard at minimum twice a week. But we find that people do it a lot more because we've got people providing peer feedback, and managers going ahead and just calling out calls and requesting, hey, I think you should take a look at this. And they'll just do the scorecard as part of that review.
Amazing. And on that note, when it comes to one-on-ones and leveraging the scorecards, would you recommend focusing on the same skill or call element in each one-on-one session until the rep has really mastered that particular skill?
I do think that that's a good way to go about it. It builds the skill over time. And if it's the thing that is useful for, as well as a manager, is that if the person's not getting better, there's probably something wrong with your training framework or your certification process, right? If multiple people are having that problem and it's taking longer than expected to get them up to snuff, that means that it might be time to take a bigger look at your entire process. So that's not great, but yeah, if you stick with it and try and get somebody to mastery on a particular skill at a time, then you'll be able to get ahead of the curve.
Totally, and it makes it digestible. It's bite-sized, if you will. One skill at a time until you're proficient, and then we move on to the next one. I love that concept. But with that, that's all we've really got for you guys today. We do have a couple of other questions, but I, again, want to be cognizant of everyone's time. If you do have any lingering thoughts or feedback for us, please tweet us. Send me a note. I'm pretty sure everyone on the line has my email address. I'll be sure to route any questions over to Chris as well. But you're welcome to tweet us. We will get back to you at some point today or this week. And honestly, thank you guys so much for tuning in. This is very exciting. We'll be doing some additional best practice webinars. Right now, we are scheduled to do these on a quarterly basis. But I'm excited to get any of your feedback. That way we can help tailor these to be the most valuable sessions for you. So thank you so much, Chris. You were great. Thank you so much for sharing how SmartRecruiters has really adopted scorecards and has developed a coaching framework around data-driven sales.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Chris. Have a great one. Bye, everyone.